For those of you who haven't heard of Nikki Ivey, she's been blowing up on LinkedIn recently with some amazing content, talking about anything from sales and working with SDR defenders, which is something I definitely want to hear more about, to selling software, selling insurance, and then even talking about just like how to better your personal self-growth and state of mind. So super excited to talk to you about selling with empathy. Before we get started, maybe just like a quick 30-second bio, give people some background on your sales background.
Okay, sweet. So rapid fire. I have been in sales for more than 10 years. I got my start selling cars. I walked onto a car lot with a friend of mine, heckled the salesman because he was a little schmoozy for me, and that guy's boss offered me a job. So then I was like, maybe there's something to this whole talking to people thing, and made the transition from selling cars, aka retail, into B2B sales in about 2014 or 15. And that is when I responded to a cattle call interview. They used to do a lot of these in B2B sales in Austin, where it's like, let's get a room full of young folks who don't know what they're doing with their lives and see if they could be salespeople. Anyway, that ended up leading me to interviewing with Scott Leese, who hired me and taught me a great deal in a very short amount of time there at Outbound Engine. I did go on to work for him another time. And in between that, or I guess including that, I got to sort of reinforce this idea that I learned that first day on that car lot, right? Which was the importance of really what we're going to be talking about here today, which is empathy. The importance of making a connection that is genuine, listening and understanding how to meet people where they are in terms of what they need versus just slapping them across the face with your agenda. And so, yeah, that's kind of how we got here. And then the fun stuff, right? The really fun stuff more recently with SDR Defenders and my Bravado group, BDR Breakthrough, has been just taking stock of some of the things that I learned and experienced in sales roles and identifying some places in the culture that have been broken, and trying to figure out, okay, how do we take this empathy, this listening, this care that we're applying, or in theory applying to our customers, and how do we make sure we're applying it to ourselves, our teammates, and the folks we lead as salespeople. And within that, I built some relationships that led to my most recent opportunity at a company called M-Train, which is an AI-powered workplace culture platform that basically helps folks, who want to go beyond checking a box when it comes to inclusion, harassment, diversity, and respect on their sales floors, and start to meaningfully build culture. So that's all the things that I'm up to right now. And all of them have a little bit to do with selling with empathy.
Awesome. No, that's a great background. And I think that a big area in which we have this opportunity as salespeople, right? And this is something I see with Bravado and Sahil is like, we're trying to change the culture, change the stereotype, right? And a lot of the time SDRs specifically are these kids right out of college. They're treated as this entry-level sales role, and they have an idea in their head as to like what that role is and what they're getting into. But in reality, we have this opportunity to shift that mold and change the way they think about it as they go in, to have it really focus on caring more about prospects and not being that traditional car salesman, like the guy that was being too schmoozy for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, like, what do you think is where's the core value come from, like with specifically empathy in outreach? Like, why is it so important that an SDR has more empathy?
I think it's super important in two dimensions. The number one is the business dimension, right? It simply is more effective to use empathy in your selling, because increasingly, especially with the current, social climate, folks just don't have the stomach for the tolerance for BS. They don't want to work with people who see them and treat them as a commission check. And so, number one, if you want to succeed, you've got to start actively caring about the folks in the industry into which you are selling. If you cannot do that, if it's just not a part of who you are, then the sales culture and the sales profession of tomorrow is likely not for you. So that's the first reason. The second reason is it just feels better, right? What we do a lot of the time, and some of the things that I was actually coached to do in some of the less effective sales cultures that I've worked in, are this idea of, don't think, just dial, or, leave your feelings. Feelings don't belong in this building, like stuff like that. And if you take that advice, and I did for a long time, then you might be, best case scenario is you're a person who's collected a bunch of commission checks and also collected a bunch of really toxic habits and really toxic ways of thinking about and treating yourself. So for the health of your pipeline and your career and the health of your own mind, body, and spirit, empathy has to be, I believe, at the core of how you approach, even just your day to day.
Totally agree. And I think that's something that salespeople struggle with, is they have to balance those two things so much more than a lot of other roles do. And like every role has to deal with this, right? Of like the personal balance of like your emotions and how you're feeling versus your career and your numbers and your KPIs. But for sales, it's amplified. It's like there's this incredible stress on your pipeline and hitting numbers. So you start to think about just close it. But you also have to think about yourself and how you can maintain that energy in a sustainable way.
That's right.
So when it comes to the top of the funnel, right? Like, 'cause that's where it all starts. It starts with, who are you reaching out to? Who actually gets value from what you do, right? And so how are we able to make sure that we're actually reaching out to people that are gonna resonate or get value from what we're trying to pitch them, that we're selling them?
I think what I would first do, and this is not something that I really learned or started to apply until a little more recently in my career, but I think it's really important, especially for new salespeople. Before we even get into all of that, vet the company that you're working for and the product, and make sure that it's a customer base that you can care about, right? That you can be interested in what their day-to-day is like. I subscribed for all too long to this idea that, the great salespeople, the greatest salespeople can sell anything. And well, maybe that's true. I don't know that they can sell anything and be happy. I don't know that they can sell anything and be fulfilled. So I think for me and for a lot of folks, what might stand in the way before you even get to, how do I reach people, is you just picked a vertical or an industry that you can identify with. You can, and you could push yourself to do that. Or you could say, it doesn't matter, I'm just here to collect a paycheck. But again, then we come to that same dead end where, you're not fulfilling yourself. So first, find something you really care about to sell. I treated that for far too long as a luxury that, only the lucky get. But really it comes down to, like I said, caring enough about yourself, having enough confidence to say, hey, I have the right, it's okay for me to be selective about where I go. And I understand that sometimes you got to do what you got to do. I have had to do what I had to do and just take a role. But think a little more deeply about that if you can. And then once you've done that, then it won't be a chore to do that next step, or the step that you're talking about, which is this top of funnel stuff. The top of funnel stuff for me always begins with, and I mean this philosophically and like in application in how I build sequences, it always begins with research. It always begins with learning as much as I can about the industry as a whole. That means even the problems that my product does not solve, but just to get a sense for what in general these people who I want to help are up against on a day-to-day, what they're excited about and happy about, as well as what they're running into as problems. I count that as top of funnel. And I feel like sometimes people skip that step and go straight to what are the activities? And those are important, but you got to get to know folks. And it helps if the industry that you're selling into, those people are active and visible on LinkedIn. But I understand that's not always the case. So one thing I like to remind people of when it comes to that top of funnel research, getting to know your ICP step is, outside of LinkedIn, trying to understand what are the communities that professionals in this industry you want to be a part of and sell into. What are the communities that they're already existing in, right? Like, is there a blog that a lot of them follow, or a newsletter you can subscribe to? Is there a Facebook group? Is there a Bravado group, right? Where are these communities, and how can you just take 2 weeks, as long as you have, right, 2 weeks, a month, whatever it is, to just be a fly on the wall in their environments and soak up as much as you can. That way, when you start to do that next step in the outreach that is top of funnel, which is connecting with those folks, for me anyway, right, as I set up my sequences, which is connecting with folks on social, on LinkedIn, or following their Twitter, you can do so in a more genuine way, in a more empathetic way, because you've cared enough to make yourself aware of what's really going on there. And people feel that. They recognize that.
I love that. I love that so much. Like this is something that's been a trend where first of all, I mean, feel so fortunate to have the opportunity to speak with you and Sam Nelson and James Bodden and all these heroes of mine that I'm now having this opportunity to interview. But like one of the things that I've noticed as a common trend is this idea of like personalization is not all about the individual contacts. It's about personalization. It's about understanding the role, about understanding what these people, as like I sell to marketers, what does a digital marketer go through versus what does a brand manager go through versus what does a CMO go through, not what does Greg go through versus what does Jenny go through. It's about zooming out and like soaking up that knowledge. And like one aspect of that is understanding the problems they go through and what your product does to solve those problems. But what you're talking about is another level deeper than that, which is how can you understand what that community is going through, what that community is doing on a day-to-day basis? How do they interact with each other? Like, how are they trying to solve problems on their own, not knowing about what you're selling to them?
Yeah.
And like, that's incredible. So with it sounds like some of the main resources you're using are social media, following like Twitter accounts or Bravado groups and LinkedIn. Is there anything outside of social that also helps with the kind of that sponge and the kind of soaking in that knowledge?
Yes. And now it was a little bit different pre-COVID, right? When I would look at events as a way to try and understand my ICP. And actually, now that things have gone virtual, it's folks like salespeople have a lot more access to be flies on the wall at these trade events and industry events, right? And to do so kind of anonymously. So if I'm selling to marketers and there's 20 virtual events this week, right, that marketers are attending that are telling them how to solve for XYZ, I can just register. Typically they're free, and just watch the stinking webinar, listen to the speakers that these folks in this industry already respect and look up to, and let that sink in. And so that's not necessarily on LinkedIn. It's not necessarily on Twitter. That might be where you find the link to go to the thing. But the thing itself is very different because you're alongside them trying to learn. And so that's sort of a more recent lever that folks can pull top of funnel to be able to try and understand the folks that they're selling into. And I have found that super helpful. And these can be formal or informal events, right? It could just be a happy hour if it's one that's big enough where you won't be noticed. Or if the person, better yet, right, if the person who is hosting this thing fits your ICP, reach out directly and say, hey, I'm trying to learn everything I can about these folks because I'm helping folks solve for XYZ, but I know that I don't know everything. Is it okay if I sit in on this? So things like that are listening to podcasts, having a podcast, inviting them on your podcast, which is a method called content-based networking that I learned at Sweetfish Media. Shout out to James Carberry and Logan Lyles. But anyway, so there are a lot more now, certainly than when I started. Different levers to pull and opportunities for folks. I'm talking, primarily about SDRs, but really at any level of an organization, if you're trying to understand those folks so that your messaging, which is the next step, right? So that your messaging then rings true with these folks.
Definitely. And that's what I want to tie that together in a second, but I just want to kind of reiterate exactly what you were saying. Like I see Dave Gerhardt talk about this all the time too, is like, you want to learn more and engage more with the market you're marketing or selling to, like start a podcast, start publishing more content, interview these people, talk to these people. I've even started to see a trend where people are having text interviews where it's like, hey, if I text you 5 questions, will you answer them real quick so I can write an article? Like people are engaging with it. And this is something I found, like I come from the photography and film community, and Instagram, before it got oversaturated more recently, it was a very open community where you could reach out to someone with 150, 200,000 followers, and they would always be so receptive to like, hey, here's a few tips on how you could edit that image better, or hey, let's hop on a call sometime, I'd love to meet you. Like that's how they got to be these million follower type people, is they engage with their community and they respond. And I think there's a lot of fear from people on LinkedIn, especially, is like all these kids that are like just brand new to their careers, kind of like I was a couple years ago, that like are hesitant about posting or reaching out. And to everyone listening that's like that, like don't be afraid to post questions. Don't be afraid to reach out to these people, because they oftentimes are receptive. That tangent aside, you take all that information right now, you've been the sponge, you've soaked it all in. How do you then tie that into your outreach? Like how do you, is it something where it affects your messaging on like a automated level for like sequencing? Is it something where you reach out directly to the person that you saw that attended that virtual event? How do you go about tying all this info that you've pulled in into that outreach to those prospects?
So there are many different ways, and yes, it is built into my sequences. So we're at week 2 or 3, and I've attended #all the webinars. I have, been using this wonderful feature on LinkedIn, which is the search content feature, right? Like I'm searching, like I said, for the example of marketing, I'm searching #marketing. And I've been, just taking note of who the people are leading conversation in that space, what they're talking about. And so now I jive that with my, my MQLs, or I jive that with whatever my target list is. And I make sure that step 1 in my sequence is the research on those at the individual level now, right? And so something like, I take this lead or this contact, I hold myself to 5 minutes, and I look for a podcast appearance. It's way easier if it's a blog. They go a little deeper in podcasts. A lot of time you can get a better sense for their personality, but a blog, you can copy and paste something that they've said. And I find that piece that I'm going to personalize to, right? So what have they said that engaged me? It has to be, for me, it has to be real. Now, some folks, that takes a little bit too much time, or they want to just get to the stuff. But for me, like, let's say I'm prospecting you. You made a post last week that was about empathy. I'll reach out to you in that first step. So the research to find that post, this is all on day 1. Step 2, day 1, I hit you up on LinkedIn with a connection request. Hey, Ricky Dash, you said XYZ, and it really resonated with me. And then the next line is, again, I'm, trying to learn everything that I can about this space, and you're somebody I really want to learn from. Let's connect. That's it. And that's the formula that you can have live in your whatever your outreach platform is that you're using. You can just copy and paste that, make it really quick, and then just plug in whatever the quote was or whatever it is that you're using to personalize. And that's it, right? And you're doing that for everybody that's on your list that you're reaching out to that day. And then the third step, which some folks will do on that same day or the next day, is an email that is a bit more broad, still only about 3 to 5 sentences, still mentions something in this person's content that resonated with you. And if you can't find something from their content because they're not active, then something that their company did or said that resonated with you. And then hook it to but more importantly, this is all Beck Holland, flip the script type stuff. So see that if you're looking for where the groundwork theory for all this came from. But anyway, so you hook it to that and then ask for the conversation on the first day. You got to go for it. Shooter's got to shoot, you feel me? And so, and so then the rest of the sequence, just takes them through that same journey, but uses a bunch of different channels to do so. But it's all centered around them. It's all centered around something that they're saying and they're doing, or that their company is saying or doing, that makes you believe that it makes sense for you guys to have a conversation. It makes you really believe that. Not just, you're on my list, we got to talk. Not just, you downloaded my ebook, we got to talk. No. Something in the ethos and the values of you aligns with the ethos and the values and the problems that I'm solving for. And that's why we're here. That, for me, is how you nail top of funnel in a way that enables and facilitates everything that comes after, to include the close, to include, the customer journey while they're with your company.
So it sounds like, let's focus on that first touch. And then I have a few questions about the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first touch, it sounds like it's more about just pure curiosity. It's not so much about, hey, I saw you did this and I can solve it. It's about, hey, I saw you did this, I'd love to learn more. So like, just to kind of sum that up, it's about that empathizing through curiosity rather than through a pitch of some sort.
That's right.
Cool. And then for the steps after that, once you do this follow-up, there's this balance that we make, right, with tools like Outreach and SalesLoft, of like automation and how do we stay efficient and streamlined versus how do we still make sure that we're empathizing, right? And I think that's where empathizing from that persona level becomes really helpful, is because then instead of it just necessarily being about that contact or company, it can be about that role or what that person might be going through, and it's like an educated guess. So how do you balance that, the like automation versus personalization? Like how do you tell when a contact is worth just doing it manual every time and going deeper, or is it generally that blend? Like, just, I know that's I'm all over the place with that question.
No. I smiled because you tapped into something that I'm actually doing right now. So I do think that there's room in most types of sale, right? At least SMB on up into enterprise and even commercial. There's room for some bit of ABM to be built into what you're doing. And what you are talking about is, how do you treat folks who are just, if they fit your ICP, differently from you treat folks who fit your ICP and are your dream prospects. So your dream prospects are the ones who are going to get, if it's me doing it, as much personalized outreach and content as possible, right? Interaction, I should say, as possible. And then the folks who are your ICP, that's where that blend comes in. So for instance, right now, the sequence that I've built, that I'm using, is the sequence prompts me to do these activities, but, and there is a framework template built in there, but at no point does the template get automatically sent out. At no point does that happen for me. And it's just, I think that's a matter of personal preference a lot of the time. And it has a lot to do with the fact that I'm working with companies, sometimes 10,000 or more employees. And so there's just not a high volume of those. And so I'm able to do it. But if we're talking about transactional or just a high volume SMB situation, then yes, I think that there's room for your first email to be this hyper personalized one, just the way that I laid out, right? And it's not going to be as difficult if you've done these steps that I've talked about. And then in like saying a 22-day sequence, your second or third email, right? So around between day 6 and day 10, right? There's room for an automated email to go out. But this automated email, the template of that can still be built because of this persona thing that you're talking about, can still be built to read, okay, this person still knows me or knows what I'm up against. So something like, again, if we're talking about marketers, it could be where you've got an article that isn't your own company's internal resource, right? It's not your marketing stuff. It's an article on like Forbes or HBR, or whatever it is, that speaks to the concerns of the folks that you sell into. that you've embedded into this email with this template, right? And it's some variation of the saw this and thought of you type email, right?
I think that's so important because I've done both, right? Like I currently am selling to, similar to you, like these super high level, like you need to be that level personalized because like they're getting 1,000 times the amount of emails another contact might be. But I've also worked in the SMB sector with like auto shops and dealerships, right? And that's very different. That's like basically hammering your head at a phone 100 times a day and hoping that someone picks up. And for that type of work, it's really easy for salespeople like myself, even at times, to fall into this trap of I'm not doing a cognitive job anymore. It's a mechanical job. And
Right.
that's where you lose that empathy, right? And it starts to just be about hammer the phone until someone's willing to take the meeting, until that person's willing to pay. But in reality, it's still not that. You still have to do this zoomed out, like understand the persona, understand the industry, and then use that. And like you still are going to be a volume based gig. It is for sure. Like your sequences might be more automated so you can hit higher numbers. You might be doing more dials a day. But if you have that knowledge, if you've done that research on the persona and the industry, when they pick up the phone, you're able to have a better conversation. You're able to have each conversation have a better chance at leading to a meeting because you're reaching out to the right people and you're still giving them better messaging. So even in the SMB, there's things you can do to be personalized. And I think that's important for people to understand. I have one more question for you, just kind of circling back to towards the beginning of our conversation. You talked about something that I value a lot, which is before you get into even taking the job, making sure that you're going to take a job with a company that you believe in, that you can follow that mission statement and actually care about it. And that makes it so much easier as a salesperson to actually care about what you sell and to be able to empathize, right? And right now we're in a pretty tough job market. And so I'm wondering for people that are less fortunate of being able to find that perfect gig and they just kind of need to get by for now, do you have any tips around like what still might be a red flag for like maybe the product's not that interesting and you don't care about it as much, but like that still might be a job worth taking versus a job that like you probably want to pay attention to these couple of red flags and maybe try to avoid it?
I think a question I like to ask is around how the role that I'm applying for became available. I think there's a lot to learn from that because one thing you're going to learn is how do these leaders talk about folks who they once believed in because they hired them, presumably, right? So are they going to throw that person under the bus and say, I've had this happen. I promise you I had this happen and I should have ran the other direction, but I did not. I asked, how did this role become available? And the dude was like, they'd fired a bunch of folks, right? We fired all of the lazy, poor performers is what he said. All of the people were lazy and poor performers? Okay. So of the remaining folks, what percentage of those folks are on track to hit quota? A very low percentage was his answer. And again, I should have darted. But I was still like, first of all, like we talked about, right? Sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. I was in a position where I needed a job and I was in this mind frame of just finding the positive and putting all the onus on myself, well, Nikki, either you can do this or you can't, right? What are you not willing and able to do to feed your family? So that's why I made that decision. I made peace with that, but I don't want other folks to have to make peace with this kind of thing. So yes, ask the question first, how did the role become available? And then listen very carefully again to how they speak about people that are on the team. Answers that are acceptable are things like, obviously things outside the company's control, right? This person moved on, they moved at a state, or, they committed some actual thing that meant that they needed to have been terminated, or, they weren't a fit. They weren't a fit. They had these parameters that they were supposed to reach within their RAM time and they didn't get there, whatever it is. But make sure that you're asking that question and thinking about whether or not these people are going to be able and willing to invest the time and patience in you that you're going to need to succeed. And if it doesn't sound like they did that with the folks before you, then you might want to keep looking, right? And that's like you hit on, right? You might not always be able to find a product that is sort of the stars aligned and this is both who I am and what I like to do type situation. I've been fairly lucky. But you can still, to your point, pay very close attention to the culture that you're walking into and to the care that you're walking into in terms of how the leaders might treat you. So I would do that first. I would research them on LinkedIn, see how they talk about people in your role in general. Like if there's a VP of sales that's constantly trashing SDRs and their outreach, nah, fam, like it's not for you. It's not worth it. But yeah, totally. That's what I would do.
No, that's awesome. And I think that's probably one of the most valuable things to come out of this conversation, because I think that it's really tricky for people to know how to go into a recruiting situation. I found that even some great salespeople are horrible at selling themselves for some reason. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I found when I first got out of college was that asking questions in an interview, making sure that it's not just you answering a bunch of stuff. Like you need to be trying to prospect them a little bit and be like, is this the right role for me? And having questions in your back pocket that you're just ready to ask every time, because you know you're going to care about that. Super important. And a lot of people struggle with it. So that piece right there, run it back, rewind this video, listen to that again, because that's a question you want in your notebook when you go into an interview.
I would be remiss if I didn't say this one more question. So SDR Defenders put out a document that was, questions every SDR should ask in an interview. And one of the call outs of that document was, we didn't ask anything about who owns culture at this organization, whose responsibility is it to build a diverse team and an inclusive and culture where folks can get a sense of belonging. And I don't know why any of the other defenders didn't include this. Maybe it's a blind spot, but for me, I intentionally did not include that because I hadn't been asking that question in interviews, because I was afraid to ask that question in interviews, because I thought it would reflect poorly on me and make me look like a troublemaker. And what if I wasn't worth that trouble? And so I would tell folks interviewing now to not do that. You matter, culture matters, and how folks answer that question, particularly the who owns culture here, the answer should be everyone, every leader and everybody who participates in the culture. And then the next steps are, what are you guys doing to make that real? But if you're not asking that question, then it may be an uphill battle when you do run into the culture issues. Who to go to, or knowing what your recourse is, or knowing, is this a me thing, or is this just like everybody is cool with this? Like to all of those things can really significantly impact your career. Again, your sense of belonging, and respect at an organization. And even the most talented people, even the most determined people, get tripped up by that, and you don't deserve it. So care enough about yourself, have enough confidence and belief in yourself to be asking those questions and hold folks accountable.
Love it. No, that's great. Seriously, I know a lot of people are out there interviewing right now and trying to find their next gig. So like this last 3 or 4 minutes that we have in this call, like please run that back, take notes. That is going to be very, very valuable for you finding the right role, not just a role, but the right role for you. Nikki, this has been amazing. I just want to give you an opportunity as we wrap up here to give a quick plug. What are you working on? Where can people find you? I know I love your content, and I'm sure other people will get a lot out of it too. So where do people find more from Nikki Ivey?
I'm all over these internet streets. Okay, so we'll start with Twitter and Instagram at No Nikki Ivey. That's KNOW Nikki Ivey, not no as in rejection. And what you can expect on Twitter is a little more casual and, dare I say, opinionated version of me. I go a little bit deeper on some of these culture things and talk about how, like, the backdrop on which they happen in society at large. Instagram is a lot of inspirational things, some sales things, and of course, culture items as well. My LinkedIn is a combination of those things, but with a much stronger focus on sales and workplace culture. And SDR Defenders. SDR Defenders, we have a hotline. So, and this just got launched last week. So if you do have questions, you're an SDR, you're an SDR leader, you're a VP of sales, you're a CRO, whomever, you have questions about how to be a good SDR, a successful SDR, that is, how to support successful sales development functions at your place, or you just want to give me your best margarita recipe, whatever it is, you call and leave a message at 888-563-SDRD. And myself or one of the other defenders will reach back out to you on whatever channel you designate for us, and try and be helpful. And we thought about this because I know a lot of folks who do have questions find that the Slack community that they're in is kind of crowded and hard to follow along with who's asking what question and who's answering. Your favorite influencer or thought leader, they likely will have a long time or a tough time, if at all, getting to your question in their LinkedIn inbox, and email, forget about it. So we were like, how do we provide a direct line from the people we want to help to ourselves? And that's the latest from SDR Defenders. Our website is under an overhaul. It's going to be great, but for now, that's the best way to get a hold of us. And if you're just interested in purely my content and the LinkedIn algorithm is not feeding it to you because for whatever reason, then my BDR breakthrough group on Bravado is the best way. And I've got some really fun, exclusive to that platform content planned for the coming months. So I would love it if you would join me there.
Yeah, shout out Bravado too. We got to get Sahil on here at some point. So shout out Sahil. Let's find some time. Thank you so much, Nikki. I really appreciate it. We'll